once for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. It's our first episode of this year of 2018, so Happy New Year to all our listeners. Christmas seems but a distant memory, although I'm quite sure that I'm carrying slightly more than a memory of a few too many mince pies. The decorations are down, the skies are grey, it's back to work, and there's an icy sleet outside. So it's time to draw the curtains, light the lamps, and settle in for a lovely, spooky story. What have we got coming up on today's episode, Fitz?
On this episode, the Paranormal Radars picked up a phantom jogger as well as a news story from 1907. There's lots of fantastic stories from our listeners. Ghosts and legends aplenty from Huntingdonshire in our latest paranormal postcard. And we've got a little update for you on some spooky goings-on at KOFY HQ on New Year's Eve.
We do, but before we get into that, we would like to give our very great thanks to all our wonderful patrons for keeping the lights on around here and allowing us to make this show. And a special shout out to Raymond Gregan, who recently upped his patron donation. Thank you, Raymond, you know how much it means to us.
Yes, the coffee elves are busy putting the finishing touches on your Knock Once for Yes coffee mug, and we'll get that out to you as soon as we can.
So, Fitz, what's pinged the paranormal radar today?
Well, it's a rather interesting story from the Staffordshire Stoke Sentinel in November. In the moorlands of Staffordshire, between the 17th century Mermaid Inn and the small village of Thorncliffe, runs a rather winding, rather desolate stretch of road. With nothing but the scrub of the moor to one side of you, and on the other, a drop-off into the valley and breathtaking views across the Peak District. On a clear day, it must be a beautifully scenic drive. But travelling it on a dark, misty winter morning is another matter entirely, as one driver was about to find out. Driving across the moorlands at 6:30 on a dark November morning, the fog clung to the landscape like a heavy blanket, and Alison Graham could barely see a few yards in front of her car. Although she had driven the route for months and knew it well, she slowed her car to under 20 miles an hour and cautiously drove through the eerie mist. As she came upon the lay-by before the Mermaid, every driver's worst nightmare happened before she could do a thing to stop it. A jogger appeared from out of nowhere directly in front of her car, where only a split second before there'd been nothing. In an interview, she said, "He was on my side of the road jogging away from me, and he was not there 1 minute and then just appeared. I had no time to avoid him. He was very tall, slim, and wearing dark clothes with reflective material to the bottom of his top and on the back of his running shoes. I panicked and hit the brakes hard. But even as she slammed on her brakes and gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, she could only watch in horror and brace herself for the inevitable impact. She saw the car hit the man, but when her vehicle made its impact, the figure broke apart and fragmented into the air. Her description was very specific. He disintegrated like confetti. It was as if he had turned into small pieces of paper right before my eyes. Then he was gone. I was shocked, amazed, and terrified all in equal quantities." Despite what she'd seen, she stopped the car fully to thoroughly check the road for any sign of an accident, but there was nothing. Nothing behind her, nothing in front of her, just the thick, enveloping fog.
Oh, well, I can see why you wanted to talk about this, because this disintegrating ghost is something that's very rare. We don't hear about very often, but I know we've both experienced. And I've talked about my experience with that on the show before. And when we had the One Candle Society guys on, and the apparition that I saw just exploded, very much like she describes. That's so interesting. A bit like confetti just exploding out. And you've seen a ghost that's sort of disappeared in that fashion as well, haven't you?
Yes, this was a bit of an epiphany for me, because even though I've had a sort of interest in the paranormal for quite a long time and I've had my own sort of experiences, there's quite a few things that I've heard over the years that I've just dismissed because they've seemed too fanciful or strange. And this reminded me of something that I saw only a few years ago now at one of the buildings I look after. And I was sat in my car. The building had recently closed, so it wasn't unusual for people to walk up to the building. And as I was sat there waiting, I saw some people walking up towards the building. And I thought, I'll let them get a bit closer, then I'll get out of the car and say, the building's closed, sorry. As I was looking at them in my rearview mirror, one of them basically did this, just sort of exploded into bits, and the other shrunk in towards a point and disappeared like an old TV turning off.
I know what you mean. I'm old enough to remember those TVs when it shrinks down to a point.
And they were both like TV special effects. And if it wasn't me that had seen them, I wouldn't believe it, and I'm not sure I believe myself having seen it.
No, and to be honest, if it was anybody else telling me that story other than you, who I trust, I would think twice, definitely. But I think that's why it's so important to share these, quite frankly, outrageous sounding stories, because they really did happen, and it is important not to dismiss stories like this out of hand. They do seem fantastical, and like you say, they sound like dodgy TV special effects. And it would be so easy to go, no, that's just too far-fetched. I don't think that can have possibly happened. But when it happens to you, you suddenly, like you say, you have an epiphany. You realise, oh my goodness, this stuff happens.
Yeah, I won't dismiss anything now.
No.
Again, I won't necessarily agree with what the people's explanation of it is. I'm not saying that I didn't have a hallucination, sat in my car, seeing people sort of walk up behind me and disappear. But
you saw something, and you saw something very specific.
Yeah, I saw something and I experienced it, and the memory stuck with me, and it feels very real to me, even if it was a hallucination. So I tend to find that people that label themselves as skeptics tend to just go, "Oh, you must have been hallucinating," and just pass it off.
And just write it off, yeah.
When even if it was the case, it still felt very real to the person experiencing it.
And it's still very unexplained.
Yeah, and if it did happen, then wow.
Yeah.
You've got a really exciting story there and something that we know nothing about. So that's my epiphany.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there, absolutely. What a fascinating story. Incidentally, do you know how the Mermaid Inn got its name?
I'm rather ashamed to admit that I don't.
No, well, when you said the mermaid, it rang a bell, and it turns out there's a bit of a legend there as well. On the moors near the inn is a small lake called Blackmere Pool. Livestock refuse to drink from it, birds never fly over it, and for many years locals believed it to be bottomless. They also believed it to be the haunt of a phantom mermaid.
Ooh.
And there are a few different legends regarding how the spirit of a mermaid ended up in a pool in the middle of the moors. The first is that of a sailor who fell in love with a mermaid on his travels at sea. He brought her home to the moors so they could be together, but the mermaid was immortal, and as the years passed, the sailor grew old and died, and the mermaid was left alone with her grief in the small, landlocked pool. Effectively trapped and unable to return home, loneliness and grief embittered her, and eventually she began luring mortals to her pool and their doom. Another, more grisly legend is that of a local girl who refused the romantic advances of a man named Joshua Linnett. He couldn't accept her rejection, and in a fit of hateful fury, falsely accused her of being a witch. Horribly, the villagers not only believed Joshua's outright lie, but found her guilty and drowned her in Blackmere Pool. But the girl was to have her revenge, and with her last gasping breath, she uttered a curse on Joshua, and 3 days later, he was found dead by the pool, claw marks across his face. The legend goes that her spirit turned into a mermaid and haunts the pool to this day. There don't seem to have been any sightings of the mermaid in recent years, although in the 19th century, locals tried to drain the pool to see if it was actually as bottomless as legend prescribed. But it's said that the mermaid rose threateningly from the pool, scaring them away and saving her home. Now, interestingly, you can still see apparently that there's a part dug an abandoned draining ditch near the pool. And so there may be some truth to that legend about them trying to drain it. And also, the pool has actually been the site of various drownings. And in 1679, a body was dumped there by a local murderer. So while the legend of a mermaid in a landlocked county in England may be a little flighty, you can see why it's got a bit of an unpleasant reputation.
Indeed, and bearing in mind what we've just said, not going to dismiss it out of hand.
No, exactly. Good point. Well, I've got another paranormal radar story for you, but it's not new news. It is from January, but January 1907. I stumbled across this story, which was published in the Derry Journal on January the 21st, over 100 years ago. Our story takes place in a village in Monmouthshire, where on the 10th of January 1907, Mr. and Mrs. Powell were peacefully asleep in their cottage, or at least Mrs. Powell was asleep. Mr. Powell was wakeful and ventured downstairs for a glass of water, but before he could quench his thirst, he was startled by a ghostly visitor. The report reads, turning his back to the fireplace, he was about to drink when his action was arrested by the apparition of a white figure gliding down the stairs. Its glance turned neither left nor right. It walked straight on and opened the door of the front parlour and disappeared. The couple kept the event quiet for some days, no doubt wary of arousing village gossip. But eventually they could keep their secret no longer and told a neighbour about the sighting. This neighbour happened to be a nurse who was familiar with many of the locals, and when Mr. Powell described the apparition to her, she recognised it to be the very image of a former resident of the Powell's cottage. A patient who, in fact, they had nursed and who had died the very night Mr. Powell saw his image gliding down his staircase.
Oh, that's a good one.
I know, and from 1907, I just love the fact that 100 years ago you were still getting ghostly reports and sightings in the newspapers just like you do today, albeit with slightly different language.
I was going to say, I really like the language that they used. You would not get that in a paper today. It neither looked right nor left. You wouldn't have that.
Arrested.
Yes, just,
arrested his actions. I love that.
You'd only get it in one of the cheaper papers.
Definitely.
And of course, it'd be bloke sees ghost.
Yeah.
We're going to give you an update in just a second about the spooky goings on at KOFY HQ. But before that, we'd like to share with you a listener story from Sarah in Bridlington.
I'm a nurse and have been for over 20 years. I've had lots of small experiences, but there are 3 main ones that come to mind. I'd recently returned home after completing my nurse training down south. Unsure of which area I wanted to specialise in, I decided to begin with elderly care. I was fortunate to get a job working on nights in an old house that had been converted into a care facility. The staff were nice to work with, and I really felt at home. One night, about 2 a.m, we were halfway round the rooms doing our checks. We'd completed the ground floor and were due to go upstairs next. My 2 colleagues went ahead, while I finished washing my hands, after which I'd go up to join them. I was in a small galley kitchen type area, and the sink was just inside the door, but sideways on. As I was completing my task, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. It was large enough to make me jump a little. I looked to see what it was, presuming my colleagues had forgotten something. And that's when I saw a black figure walk past the door from right to left. Judging by the outline of the clothes, it was a woman. It happened so quickly that I didn't know what to think, but I looked to see where it went and saw the figure walk down the corridor, stop outside room 6, then disappear. Not quite knowing what to do, I went upstairs to my colleagues. I didn't want to say anything as I was still quite new, so I decided to just carry on. But my face must have shown something, as I was immediately asked if I was okay. I assured them I was fine, but had just had a strange experience. I explained to them what happened, and instead of laughing at me, they said, "Oh dear, that means someone's going to pass away." "What? What are you talking about?" They explained it was something that had been seen many times by many people, and it always appeared before somebody died. I previously knew nothing of this and wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Nothing else happened for the rest of my shift, and I went home to sleep, ready for my next one. I would have probably thought they were winding me up, except that the next night when I went into work, I was told one of the patients had died during the day. But it was when I found out that it was the patient in room 6 who had died that really made me consider that there may be more to it. In the same building about 6 months later, I had another experience. I had been caring for a lady who would be confused and had a tendency to wander always during the night. She'd remember to put on her dressing gown and always wore a headscarf. Unfortunately, she disturbed others by entering their rooms and messing with their bedding and pillows, so we set up a monitor outside her door to warn us. This lady sadly died. It was expected, and nothing unusual happened. About 4 weeks later, the call system activated, so my colleague went to answer it. Soon after, she rang the emergency bell, which meant I went running. When I got to the room, my colleague looked shaken. I asked what was wrong, and she said the lady who occupied the room was on the floor. I couldn't understand why this would spook her, but went in to see what had happened, presuming she'd fallen. On entering the room, the lady was indeed on the floor at the side of the bed, but how she was laying was strange. She was laid on her back and her pillow placed perfectly under her head and all the bedding perfectly neatly on her. It looked like the bed had been made on the floor. This was strange enough, but it was what happened next that really spooked me. Whilst assessing her to identify any injuries, I asked her what had happened, and I was not prepared for her answer. "Oh, I didn't fall, nurse." "But you're laid on the floor," was my reply. "Oh, I know, a lady put me here." Assuring her that we would not have done that, and wondering if she was unwell, my mind was focused on what to do next, but she wasn't finished. "It was the old lady." This made me focus on what she was saying a bit more. "What old lady?" was my next question. "Oh, an old lady came in and put me and my bedding down here. She was in her nightclothes." This lady was a new admission and had not met the previous resident who enjoyed messing with people's bedding. And besides, it couldn't be, could it? Then she said, "She seemed nice and she had a lovely headscarf on." My final experience was somewhere else. I was working in a place where all the rooms were off one L-shaped corridor, all on one level. The patients were a mixture. There was one particular patient who had dementia and often said strange things, so I admit we didn't always fully believe everything he said. One evening, we'd settled him into bed. He couldn't walk and could only transfer with a Zimmer frame and help from 2 staff. Before we left his single room, he was getting quite agitated, saying that something was going to get him and there was something in the wardrobe. Despite trying to reassure him, he would not settle. So in the end, to try and relieve his distress, we moved a big, heavy armchair in front of the wardrobe door, assuring him this would keep the wardrobe shut. This seemed to help, and he settled down in bed. So we left the room, leaving the Zimmer near the door and leaving the door open in case he became frightened. Less than 5 minutes later, we were still in the corridor when we heard an almighty crash. We ran towards the noise. It was the room we'd just left. The gentleman was still laid in the bed. However, other things weren't as we had left them. The Zimmer was on the floor, sideways. I mean, okay, this could have fallen over. But it was when we looked at the heavy armchair that we freaked out a bit. It was no longer in front of the wardrobe, but over on its front. And the wardrobe door, it was wide open. Absolutely wide open. We would not go anywhere alone for the rest of the night. And even now, I get the chills and the hair stands up on the back of my neck as I remember the feeling in that room.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that story, or stories, perhaps I should say.
So many profound experiences going on there. I mean, where do you even start? The first story with I'm sure there's a proper name for it, but portent ghost, or maybe harbinger, warning that somebody was about to die. I mean, you hear of those sorts of ghosts so many times. They pop up again and again through history and in the modern day, but they've always really made me wonder, I mean, why? Why did it? Because whoever spirit that portent must have been once, they can't possibly have anything to do with the people who are about to pass away. Do you know what I mean? So why do they walk to warn of their impending death?
Discarding my skeptic role briefly,
Again,
I'm wondering whether, as people sort of
get closer to the veil,
they become visible to the people that are already on the other side.
Maybe.
And it's just a case of wandering around and go, oh, hello, who are you?
Yeah, or maybe going to meet them, but yeah, as you say, you'd have to take your skeptic hat well and truly off to discuss.
Yeah, that was throwing it off in the back of the cupboard and coming out, as it were. But no, I honestly have no idea. But it is fascinating.
But it's always just really fascinating me why that happens.
Yeah, like you say, there's hundreds of them throughout history that have, so it's a very interesting thing.
And
but
obviously,
it seems to be quite common.
All the staff knew about it as well. It happened all the time from the sound of it. They all knew what was going on.
Yeah, it was a known thing and accepted, and it's just like, oh no, somebody's going to die. It wasn't like, oh my God, you've seen a ghost, how weird. It's, right, you're part of the club now, you've seen it, and best get prepping for what's coming. And it was the same room as well that it went to.
Yeah, well, and that's what she said, that, that's when it really hit her, when she found out that the person died had been in the room that she saw the ghost disappear outside of, so, yeah.
I'm most interested by the one with the cupboard and the chair
the wardrobe. What was going on there?
Oh, I don't know, but it was obviously strong enough to push a chair out the way and knock his Zimmer frame over.
Yeah, that poor gentleman obviously had a very good reason to be concerned. I've just got to wonder if they'd ever had any other things going on in that room before, because that's something so physical.
Yeah, and as to whether he brought it with him sort of thing, or whether it was there already. But
I hadn't even considered that, actually. I was thinking it was something to do with the building, but you're right. I wonder how long that patient had been there. Perhaps that resident had brought it with him, you're right. Well, I've got to say, the one that really made the goosebumps stand straight up on my arms was when the lady who was out of her bed and all perfectly neatly tucked up on her floor just described the previous resident of the room so accurately.
That's a strange one. It's like, why on earth did she sort of put her to bed on the floor?
I don't know. I mean, it's quite sweet, really. She'd obviously done it nicely.
Didn't mean any harm or anything.
No, I don't think so.
What are you doing in that nice soft bed? You should be lying on this floor.
But the part where the old lady just said it was this lady and she was wearing a lovely headscarf, just as if it was no big deal. Oh, the hair on my arms just straight up.
No, heard in isolation, that's a good story, but I'm still more freaked out by the thing in the cupboard. The wardrobe, very freaky. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that wonderful story. Before we go to our next story, we promised you an update on some of the spooky goings on at KOFY HQ.
Yes, and you had the first one actually, didn't you, Fitz? The knocking on the front door is back.
Yes, it was a lot more gentle this time. I just happened to be passing the door, and it sounded like someone had so gently tapped with the door knocker on the door twice. And I presumed it was the mother-in-law because she's like a tiny little fairy when she knocks on the door.
She is, it's so quiet.
So I opened the door and there was nothing there, nobody on the street, nobody about, no wind. It was, so still that, and even then I've never heard the door knocker go in the wind before. But it surprised me, but I didn't think too much of it.
But then it happened to me a day or so later. I was at home on my own and I ran downstairs thinking it was a parcel delivery, quite excited. Unfortunately, it was not. Again, there was nobody there. It wasn't the loud bang, bang, banging that it was the first time I'd heard it. It was more just like a postman knock. But again, nobody in the street. It wasn't windy. Nobody around. Don't know what it was. The other little thing we had happen was I came upstairs to do some work in the studio. And as I opened the door, I saw that there was a bottle of my nail varnish, which I normally just leave on the shelf, right in the middle of the floor, upright, placed perfectly right in the centre of the floor, where you would just have no reason to leave it. And even if it had fallen off the shelf, it wouldn't have fallen where it was, if you know what I mean. And I doubt it would have fallen upright either. So don't really know what that was about. It's not massively spooky, just a bit weird. But then we had New Year's Eve.
Yes. Now, if anyone's familiar with the Kinect from an Xbox, you'll know what we're about to talk about. If you don't, you may recognise them from what's often termed a sort of structured light sensor on the ghost hunting programs, where it sort of maps a figure. If you don't know about that, then I'll give you a very brief explanation and try not to bore you. Basically, it sends out a grid of laser light and it can recognise a figure moving by judging the movement of the light. That's a very, very simplified explanation. Now, it's on the console we use for watching television on, and it basically picks up your body movements and you can use it to control games and also to change channels and do various things like that. So we'd watched a programme and it had gone back to the main menu and it picked up something moving. Now, bearing in mind that we were both sat perfectly still, and we're used to this thing now, it does pick the cats when they walk past it.
Yeah, it sometimes has a fit when a cat walks past, but it then soon calms down.
Yes, but the cats were either upstairs or asleep on the sofa. And like I said, we weren't moving.
No,
and
we were sitting perfectly still.
We could see on the screen the cursor moving around, and it seemed to be attempting to do things on the screen.
Well, this was the weird thing. See, like I say, sometimes it does get set off by something moving in the background. If you start waving your arms around, it'll pick things up and it will have a bit of a hissy fit, really. It will do all sorts of random things and go hither and thither. This wasn't like that, which was why it was weird. There was no movement in the room at all. All the cats were elsewhere. We weren't moving. But the way it was moving seemed like it was trying to navigate the menus. It was so strange. But then it got even weirder. We made eye contact with each other, and being of the mindset we are, we immediately thought, this is a bit spooky. What's going on here? And so Fitz says out loud, "Hello? Who's there?" And then it got really weird.
Yes, now Lil seems to think that what happened next was whatever it was trying to run out of the room, but it almost seemed to me like it was waving, like the cursor sort of went right off to one side of the screen and then right off to the other side of the screen. Now, Lil thinks it was trying to run out the front door and then couldn't, and then tried to run out the back door, but it almost seemed to me like it was waving.
Well, on the Kinect screen, you've got sort of directional arrows to show which way the movement's going. So when Fitz spoke to it, it did this big bleep noise, which I'm not sure what that was about, and then the arrows went one way, and then the arrows went back the other way, and it just, to me, looked every bit like somebody had suddenly realised we could see them and panicked and tried to get out. But I can see what you mean about the waving. It could equally be the same thing. You'd spoken to them, it realised we could see it, and it was actually trying to wave rather than escape, So it depends how you look at it.
And then I think it wanted to watch the next episode of whatever we were watching, because what you normally do is sort of hold your hand up in the air and you can see where the cursor is on the screen. You just hold it over the play next episode button and a little timer goes round, and when the timer reaches, it presses the button for you. And it basically did that. It went sort of 2/3, 3/4 of the way round and then stopped. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll ask. And I put it onto the search screen because I thought if there's anything here and it can communicate, then at least it'll have a way of spelling things out then.
A bit like Stranger Things, we've got the letters on the screen, so it could have pointed at the letters essentially, like a digital Ouija board sort of thing.
Oh, digital Ouija board. That's a good idea. We should try that.
That's essentially what we were doing, because it was such a deliberate movement when it hovered over the button. It's actually, if you tried it yourself, it's not that easy to do. You do have to hold your hand hovering over this button on the screen for quite a long time, don't you? And then only when the timer goes all the way around, it decides that you really mean it and it presses the button. And the timer went round almost like a fraction of a second before the button would have pushed it, and it sort of failed at that point, but it was so close.
Yeah, it was weird, and you have to be really deliberate over it. If it's struggling to pick you up or anything like that, the cursor jitters all over the place, and it wouldn't do that, basically. It just wouldn't work. And it's never done it before.
No.
We hadn't changed the room. We had the curtains closed because it was the evening, so the light wasn't varied, or it's never done anything like this before.
And we've had this for years, haven't we? We use it all the time.
Years, yeah, it's been a long time. And it was really strange. But when we changed it to the menu and said, use the letters if you can, nothing. It just stopped.
Unfortunately, which was a bit sad.
Yeah, we were really hoping to get a message through, because that could have been fun.
That could have been amazing if it had been able to point at the individual letters. I think now I'm almost tempted to put the search screen back at some point and try it again, because how amazing would that be if we could get a message through via the Connect search screen? But sadly, that night it was not to be.
So yes, what do you think? We'd love to hear if you've had similar experiences, or if you just think it's a computer glitch, let us know.
Please do that. Well, I think we'll have another story now. This one is from John L. in Connecticut.
I'm going to take you back to my college years at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. I was a senior at the time and living in one of the newest buildings on campus. We all know Boston has a storied history and some quite famous and bloody incidents. But I never had any paranormal experiences while exploring the city. I never even caught the slightest whiff of what you might call uneasiness or heavy pressure. Especially living in a fairly new facility, you would think, what are the chances of your dorm room being haunted? Okay, maybe I never even thought to ask myself that question, but it would be a question I would have to ask myself later. It was a day like any other on my campus. Nothing spectacular or out of the ordinary happened, and I was coming back from a late session at the animation lab working on my final project before graduation. At this point, it was fairly late, and I decided to grab some food and head back to my dorm room. I lived in a suite-style apartment with 3 other roommates, and we all had our own rooms. It was a great living situation, and I had no complaints with my roomies. This also happened to be one of those random nights when none of my roommates were home. Sometimes it can be fairly quiet, and when that's the case, even a little spooky. But I felt oddly calm that night. After dinner, I spent a few hours surfing the web and decided it was time to hit the sack. Before bed, I like to lower the temperature in my room because I'm a bit of a hot sleeper. After falling asleep, the next thing I remember is being woken up by something. It wasn't a sound or even a light since the room was pitch black. Instead, it was more of a feeling. My first reaction was to move, but I slowly started to notice after trying that I couldn't. Someone or something was on top of me. I had never experienced anything like this before, but my first thought was confusion. I couldn't quite understand why I couldn't move since I couldn't see anything in front of me. Keep in mind, I wear contacts and I didn't have my glasses on at the time. I couldn't see much of anything but blurs, even if someone was on top of me. However, there was one thing for certain. I felt a heavy pressure on my chest. It was almost as if someone was sitting on me. My breathing started to get heavier. I was falling into an anxiety-filled panic, and in my struggle to break free, I started to notice something odd. Typically, when I laid on my bed in college, I could see the light hanging above my bed. At night, my eyes adjust to the darkness fairly well, and I can make out the faint shape of the light fixture. But not tonight. It was pure black in front of my face as I laid there in my bed. I couldn't see anything beyond this pure black. As I squinted my eyes to try to make out what I was seeing, it was a shape of a person, a shadow. Wait, is someone really attacking me? Was my next question. Perhaps I had left the door unlocked when I came into the suite. I didn't know what to think, but I knew I had to make some kind of sound and find a way to get whoever this was off of me. As I started to yell out, I felt a pressure around my neck tightening. I couldn't speak. It felt as if something was choking me. It was hard to breathe, it was hard to move, and I was surrounded by pitch black. Fear was all I could think of. I've had my fair share of scary moments in my life, but I've never been that scared. I remember laying there thinking, oh God, please help me, but nothing changed. I was still in this helpless position. I made one last-ditch effort to escape and was finally able to say something. Stop! I yelled. Gone. The darkness, the heaviness, the inability to speak, all gone. I immediately sat up and looked around. I turned on my lights and checked the rest of the suite. Nothing was there. None of my roommates had returned. It was just me and the walls. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep that night. Well, actually, I stayed up and played video games until my eyes gave out on me. You might ask, how was I able to stay in the room? I didn't. I took my games into the living room and passed out on the couch. Eventually, I was able to go back to sleep in the room, and I never did encounter it again. I'm not sure what it was. A dream? Too real. Some trick of the mind? I've never been able to do it to myself before. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to like me very much. The only question I was left with after recalling this encounter was, can a dorm room of a new building really be haunted?
Thank you, John, for that story. And actually, John sent us 2 stories, so we're saving the second one for you for the next episode. But that did sound a bit sinister, despite the fact that he hadn't had any previous experiences. Now, one of his questions was, can a new building be haunted? Well, in my experience, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't seem... obviously, you get a lot of tales about old buildings have hauntings of people that lived there or died there or what have you. But I've experienced something at a house where it was new and there was nobody died there. It's literally just, it'd been built sort of 20, 30 years later, we started experiencing things. So who knows?
Yeah, I had a friend who lived in a house that had quite a lot of activity. And again, yeah, that was a modern house. Don't think that anybody died there. There was no real reason, no history behind it for it to be haunted. But there were strange things going on. So it doesn't seem to make any difference whether it's new or not in a lot of cases. Now, we have talked about sleep paralysis on the show before, and it is something that we asked John because that was our first thought. sleep paralysis I have had, it is horrible. And it's when you wake up and your brain is still in sleep mode, basically. So it doesn't allow your body to move to stop yourself from sleepwalking and doing harm to yourself, essentially. John said he hadn't had sleep paralysis, but the thing that frightened him most was not just the feeling of pressure on his chest, but the tightening around his throat. He said he could actually feel hands. Now, that is not normal for sleep paralysis, certainly not in my experience of sleep paralysis. It can feel a little bit like pressure on your chest simply because you can't move, so it feels like you've got a bit of a physical barrier there that's stopping you getting up, but it doesn't feel like somebody's on you, and it certainly doesn't feel like, I've never had the feeling of hands tightening around my throat.
No, I mean, it's quite often interpreted as something on your chest, like sitting or standing on your chest. But yeah, like you, I've never heard of the hands around the throat. That was a new one on me.
And there was also the fact that his vision was being blocked by this thick, sort of dense black mass that meant he couldn't see, the light fitting what he could normally see. And I have to say, John, like you, I am very short-sighted. I cannot see anything much without my glasses on either. But like you say, you can make out blurry shapes and the familiarity of the room. So that it did sound like there was something in the way of that, something blocking your vision, which is a bit terrifying.
Yeah, and this was another thing that intrigued me. And I don't know if any biologists or doctors would be able to help with this one. But a common theme with sleep paralysis, it's been tied to things like incubus and succubus, where things are having their way with you in the night. And people hallucinate these things because they're still partially in a dream state. And I'm wondering whether the brain would sort of give you a blurry image or something that wasn't obvious, because he said he had to figure out that there was something blocking the light.
Which would make sense, being that he was short-sighted. And you, like I say, I know only too well it's so blurry when you've not got your glasses on. But why would your brain project an image in keeping with your short-sightedness? I mean, that doesn't happen to you in dreams. When I dream, I don't dream in short-sighted vision, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's weird. So I'd be intrigued to know if that's something that's been reported with people that have had not necessarily hallucination, but that sort of thing, dream state, and they report that something is out of focus as it would be if they were actually looking at it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, whatever it was, we're glad it never happened to you again.
Very much so. It sounds absolutely terrifying. Well, we've got another story for you now. This one's from Kira in Glasgow, who sent us a story previously, which we very much enjoyed. This one involves premonitions and a time slip. Before we begin, a quick content warning. This story contains descriptions of a car crash and the London terror attacks of 2005. If this might be a trigger for you, please skip ahead to the timestamp 4900 exactly and enjoy the second half of the story about a time slip. I've never really considered myself psychic, although I have been fascinated by the paranormal since I was a child, and love all things strange, unexplained, and unusual. I have had a few strange premonition or vision experiences that have always made me question whether there's more to the universe than meets the eye. The first experience I can remember was the morning the news was broken that Princess Diana had died. I was still quite young when it happened, just starting my second year at secondary school. That night, I had a really strange, unsettling dream that I was flying through a dark tunnel. I remember entering the tunnel from a yellowish light, like the glow from street lamps. Lights were flashing and there were crashing, booming, crunching noises that terrified me. That's all there really was to my dream. I just kept flying through utter chaos for several seconds, which felt like ages, until I awoke with a start. Immediately, I had this black dread come over me, and I just knew something terrible had happened. There was not a doubt in my mind. I had no idea what it was. There were no specifics as such to my dream. I just knew with absolute certainty that I had to turn on my radio. I got up from my bed and turned on the radio on the hi-fi system my parents bought me for my birthday not long before. And before I knew it, I was listening to the broadcasters on Radio 2 that Princess Diana had died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. I was so freaked out that I had just known that something was wrong. I ran through to my parents' room and told them that Princess Diana had died and that I had foreseen this in a dream the night before. My mum and dad didn't believe a word I said and frankly was so shocked and upset by the news that my premonition was just shrugged off. I chalked it up to coincidence and didn't think any more of it. But the same thing happened many years later when I was at university. I had another dream that I was in a dark tunnel once again. I wasn't flying this time, actually quite the opposite. I felt trapped, and in fact was lying on a hard floor. There was twisted metal all around me, and although I couldn't make out much of my surroundings, I thought I was on the floor of some kind of bus or train. I started to panic as I couldn't breathe. It was as if something was putting tremendous pressure on my chest. I felt a crushing weight pinning me to the ground, and slowly a heavy smoke started to fill the darkness, and I began to hear moans and screams from other people around me, begging for help. Once again, I awoke with a jolt to discover that I was in my room and I was quite safe. But again, I had that really black, horrible feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I knew something was really wrong, and I had this horrendous feeling that my sister was in terrible danger. This time I was really panicking. I jumped from my bed and turned on the TV. The hi-fi had long since been upgraded, and I was absolutely astounded and horrified to see that there'd been a terror attack in London. It was the 7th of July, 2005. My sister had moved to London a few years before. She lived and worked very close to the King's Cross area and often jumped on the tube or took the bus to work in the morning. I was terrified that something had happened to her and immediately tried to phone her. It took me ages to get through, but I eventually did. Thankfully, she'd made it to work safely an hour or so before the bus exploded in Tavistock Square. But she had heard and felt the boom of the explosion. She was really rattled, as the office had been told to lock its doors and for everyone to remain in a central area away from any glass windows. This was ironic, considering that at the time she was working in a very fancy building that was made almost entirely out of metal and glass. Obviously, I was so relieved that my sister was safe, but I still had that horrible feeling of dread long into the day. It really stayed with me until the event was over and everybody had been cleared from the subway tunnels. I can't say if my dream was accurate or not, but to this day I still remember that feeling of being trapped in the darkness and the noise of those poor souls crying out for help. A few years before this, I also had a strange experience when I lived for a year in Granada in Spain. I was studying Hispanic Studies at the University of Glasgow, and as part of this course, we had to spend a year studying or working abroad. I opted to study Arabic and Portuguese at the University of Granada, and I just arrived in the city. I was a bit green then, as I lived at home with my parents, and this was the first time I was going to have to go out into the world on my own and in a different country to boot. My mum and her friend had come with me to help me move into my flat and see the city. I think my mum really wanted to make sure that I was safe there and had a place to stay. One of the first things we did was visit the Alhambra Palace. As we'd just arrived in the city, I didn't know anything about its history or anything. I was just mesmerised by the beauty of the palace and the city, which has a really wonderful atmosphere. We began our tour of the palace in the Generalife, the luscious gardens and outbuildings of the palace. We were just walking through one of the open structures when all of a sudden I felt a really warm, calm feeling wash over me. I stood rooted to the spot and watched in amazement as the gardens transformed in front of me. Everything began to look much brighter and more colourful. The walls transformed from their whitewashed appearance to ornate arabesques. I slowly began to feel the weight of many layers of fabric draped over my body. I smelled the heady scent of flowers and spices in the air. I watched in amazement as the people around me drifted away and were replaced by rugged, dark-skinned men in turbans and flowing robes, speaking in low, gruff voices and a language I could not understand. I hadn't yet begun my studies in Arabic, and I'm sure I probably wouldn't have recognised the Arabic of the 1300s anyway. I stood there watching in total amazement, as I was no longer in my time. I knew it. I could feel it. I knew it was years before, and I was seeing the Alhambra as it once was. I didn't feel scared or upset or panicked. I felt such a feeling of complete and utter love for this beautiful place that I just smiled and drank it all in. As soon as it had reached its full vibrancy, the vision started to clear again, and I was slowly returned to my own time. The bustle returned and the noise of the fountains faded back in. I blinked a couple of times and took a deep breath. The spicy floral scent was no longer, and the air felt cool against my skin. To this day, I remain convinced that I'd experienced some kind of time slip or past life regression of some kind. Afterwards, I felt completely at home in the city. It was almost like the Alhambra Palace was welcoming me home and reminding me that I'd been there before. I have no idea if what I saw was real or a figment of my imagination, but it remains one of the most wonderful and bizarre experiences of my life.
Thank you, Kira, for getting in touch with those fascinating stories. For those that may have skipped ahead, we won't go into too much detail in our discussion of the stories.
Except to say, it must have been really distressing and terrifying for you, Kira. And we've said this on the show before, it just always leads me to wonder when we hear these stories about premonitions, whether they're more of a curse than a blessing, really.
Yeah, they never seem to be in time to be able to do anything about it.
This is the thing. If you were having premonitions and you could stop something, that would be one thing. But to just empathise with the trauma of what happened to other people is, like I say, it's just distressing rather than helpful. But the time slip story was amazing.
That was really interesting. It just sounds like such an amazing thing to have experienced, like a historic building in its heyday. It's I'd love to have seen it.
And to have that sense of coming home in a way that she described as well, almost like it was welcoming her.
Yeah, it was interesting because it obviously had that lasting effect of making her feel more comfortable there.
Yeah, which is really lovely. We haven't had many time slip stories, but I know they do happen. If anybody out there has a time slip story, please send it in, because we'd love to get more of those and see if there's patterns or anything exciting like that. In fact, if anybody has stories they'd like to send in, we've said it before and we'll say it again, your stories are the heart and soul of this show. They're really why we started this podcast in the first place. We love hearing them. We love sharing them. Please do send them in. If you have a story you'd be willing to share with us, just pop on over to our website at knockoncefororyes.com and visit the Send Us Your Stories page.
It's time now for our paranormal postcard adventure, and this one comes to you from Cambridgeshire. Or possibly Huntingdonshire, depending on who you speak to.
I know. It's one of those oddities of England. It's called Huntingdonshire, and it was its very own shire up until 1974, when somebody decided it was too small to be a shire of its very own. So although it's called a shire, it's been swallowed up by Cambridgeshire, which is a little bit sad.
Oh,
I know, but whichever shire you prefer to call it, it's a beautiful place, a survivor of the ever-creeping industrial sprawl, with pretty little villages full of history tucked away down winding country lanes. And the legend I was chasing concerns 3 of these pretty little villages: Alconbury, Brampton and Diddington, with a haunted pub thrown in for good measure. I was chasing the legend of the ghostly drummer boy, and it begins in August of 1780 with Gervase Matcham, sometime sailor, military deserter, and ultimately murderer. Matcham had spent his life bouncing from ship to shore and in and out of the military. Picking his battles as he fancied, he took to sea or war when it pleased him, and deserted when it didn't. Accounts vary around his origins, but many versions of the tale place his home village as Brampton, which could explain how he came across the 49th Regiment of Foot while they were recruiting in Huntingdon, just a couple of miles away. And despite having recently deserted the 13th Regiment of Foot, Matcham promptly enlisted with the 49th and donned the distinctive scarlet uniform. On the 19th of August 1780, Matcham was sent on an errand of some 7 miles to retrieve subsistence funds from a Major Reynolds in Diddington. He was assigned a companion, a young lad named Benjamin Jones, who served as the regiment's drummer boy and was son to the recruiting sergeant. The pair successfully collected the money, with young Jones in charge of the funds under his father's instructions, and Matcham as his protector. But Matcham didn't have protection on his mind. He was thinking about those golden coins the boy held so tightly, and about how much freedom they could buy him, at least for a time. He was a fighter, yes, cunning and crooked, no doubt, but he'd not murdered in cold blood before, and certainly not a mere slip of a boy. But 6 guineas could get him away from this place and back to sea, and his standing in the 49th was already shaky. Frantically scheming, Matcham shifted their course of travel away from Huntingdon and led the boy towards Alcombury and the main coaching road where he could make a hasty escape. But by now the boy had grown suspicious of his shifty behaviour, and if Matcham hadn't already committed his mind to murder, then the boy's obvious suspicion sealed his fate. Others in the regiment were already doubtful of Matcham's character after all, and this boy had only to speak ill of him to his father, and all would be lost. He decided that his only way of escape was along the coaching road, alone, and with the 6 guineas lining his pocket. In a ruthless bid to save his own skin, he dispatched the unfortunate boy with a clasp knife and made off with gold to ditch his incriminating uniform and make once more for the sea. But the poor drummer boy's story did not end there. Matcham spent the next 6 years at sea, working as he sailed through France, Russia, the West Indies. But he couldn't run forever, and in July of 1786, he finally landed at Plymouth and was dismissed as too old for service. Collecting his pay, he set off with a crewmate to find lodgings at an inn. Maybe his now uncertain future prompted his past to catch up with him, or maybe being thwarted in his usual pursuit for adventure brought to mind the crimes he'd been running from. Or maybe it was the tremendous and unnatural lightning storm that suddenly blew up around them, as though visiting the drummer boy's retribution upon the sailors. But Matcham's companion could only look on in horror, as the man was overcome with fits of terror, wide-eyed and cowering from apparitions that his crewmate could not see. He appeared to come under some invisible attack by phantoms that appeared then sank into the earth and stones that dashed against his feet. But his companion saw nothing. At last, Matcham exclaimed, "Who is that little drummer boy, and what business has he to follow us so closely?" Matcham could take it no longer and came to the realisation that the only way to cease the haunting the victim of his cold-blooded crime was to confess to the murder. Drawing a huge sigh, he spilled the whole sordid truth to his crewmate and begged to be taken to the authorities. He was convicted and hung for his crimes, and for the shame he brought upon the regiment, he was forced to don the scarlet uniform once more as his last act upon this earth. His lifeless body was displayed in a gibbet as a warning to other would-be criminals. The tattered red rags of his uniform flapping horribly in the breeze for many a year to come. You'd think the drummer boy would have made his peace, having driven his murderer to confession. But locals traversing the road from Alcombury to Alconbury West have reported for centuries the sound of phantom footsteps following them down the road, and on a quiet night, the tap, tap, tapping of a drum.
That is a really good legend creepy story thing.
I know. I so wanted to tell it in the proper oral tradition. I don't want these legends to be lost, and I think they should be told orally like they have been all through history. We don't want to lose them. But as with any good spooky legend, the story has, of course, grown and been embellished over the years, and even inspired Barham's poem, The Dead Drummer of Salisbury Plain. We don't really know much of Matcham's character, and everybody who has ever recounted the tale has added their own flavour, including me. Of course, the tale became famous around the county as well, and everybody wanted to claim a piece of the legend, so it all adds up to making it quite difficult to pick the truth from the stories. But a written account from the time corroborates Matcham's confession, including the visions of ghastly apparitions.
Oh wow, I wasn't expecting you to say that.
No, I know. And the Earl of Sandwich apparently received a letter confirming discovery of the boy's body. And just south of the village of Alconbury, there's even a landmark known as Matcham's Gibbet.
I just need to cut in briefly and say I really appreciate the fact that you spent all this time and effort to work out how to say Generalife for the story, and yet you got Salisbury wrong.
Oh, no. Oh, that's hilarious. I'm normally so fastidious at checking how to pronounce names overseas that I didn't even think to check the ones in my own country. It happens, guys. So anyway, while there's not quite enough historical fact there to corroborate the legend in its fullness, there certainly are bits of history that would point to there being a good basis for this story.
I would say that you've got all the salient points. You've got a dead drummer boy, and you've got somebody admitting to the crime of killing the dead drummer boy because of spooky things.
And you've even got a landmark named for the murderer. Now, as you can imagine, the gibbet itself evoked much fear and trepidation to the locals who had to pass it on their travels, because it sounds like they left it up for some years, not just a short amount of time. And some of the younger inhabitants used to make a dare of approaching the horrifying spectacle. One freezing night, 3 such lads got rather carried away with overconfidence and dared one another to climb the ladder and tease the skeleton with a bowl of hot broth to warm its bones. One lad rose to the challenge and duly climbed a ladder with a steaming bowl, but as he came face to face with the empty-socketed skull, a voice whispered harshly in his ear, "Cool it, cool it." He fell backwards off the ladder in shock and was never quite the same again. As you wouldn't be.
No, that's a bit of a weird one. I must admit that the pranks of ye olden days do seem a bit tame compared to modern ones.
Offering a bowl of soup.
Yeah, I dare you to give it some soup.
Well, bless him. It was probably very boring in Brampton that time. But yes, I don't think I'd be quite the same again after an empty socketed skull had whispered in my ear. But some locals, however, maintain that the gibbet wasn't in Alcombury at all, but in Brampton. But in any case, phantom sightings would imply that Matcham himself was rather fond of the hostelry in the area, namely the 16th century inn, the Black Bull, which brings us to our haunted pub. Matcham's apparition has reportedly been seen inside the bar, wearing seafaring garb, as well as outside, seeming to walk between the Black Bull and another pub, the Dragoon. Maybe he was trying to drown his sorrows, and who knows. And as for the drummer boy, contrary to the legend, the most recent sightings have actually been in Diddington, the original destination of his errand to collect the money. Now, I got a wonderful book for Christmas from the stacks of ghost books that I got. I got a veritable library of ghost books for Christmas. But one of my favourites was The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire by Mark Edgerton. And he managed to track down accounts of modern eyewitnesses who may have encountered the boy's apparition, but they're not in Alconbury, they're in Diddington. All the accounts happen near Diddington Brook and involve the darting, ghostly figure of a boy in a red coat. Now, I won't spoil the details for any potential readers of Mark's book. If you're an avid collector of these types of books like I am, it's a worthy edition, and it's not one of these thin A5 ones either. It's a big, chunky A4 book full of pictures. And one of the things I like about it is that Mark is actually a paranormal investigator himself. So a lot of the places he's written about, you're not just getting the history and the legends, you're also getting some investigation reports, which is pretty exciting. And we'll put the link for that in the show notes. It's The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire. But to go back to our haunted pub for a minute, it turns out that our murderous sailor is not the only resident ghost of the Black Bull. Now, standing outside the Black Bull, you can see St Mary Magdalene Church right next door, or Mary Magdalene, depending on where you're from in the county and how you prefer to pronounce it while we're talking about that. And walking a few paces from the pub will take you up a couple of steps into the churchyard, where a winding path runs through the large and beautiful graveyard. At the back of this graveyard is a gated fence backing onto an open field. And just a short way off in the distance, on the crest of a slight rise, is a quaint, old-looking, whitewashed house. And this is the sometime childhood home of Samuel Pepys.
For those that aren't aware, Samuel Pepys was an administrative officer in the Navy, but he actually became famous as a diarist. He kept a diary starting from the 1st of January 1660 and kept on for nearly 10 years. Much of our recorded history from that time is very clerical and dry, facts and figures, but no real body to it.
No meat.
Pepys wrote candidly about himself, his family, his work and politics, literally everything that affected him. And bearing in mind he lived through the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London, it's given us a peek into the realities of a history that we're rarely granted.
And I believe you have a favourite Pepys story of your own.
Yes, Samuel Pepys is rather famous for burying things.
Which we'll come to later as well.
I think he's got some dog genes in him. Because he, like the minute that disaster strikes or is on the horizon, he buries stuff.
He's out in his garden burying everything.
He's quite famous for burying a wheel of Parmesan cheese in his garden just before escaping the Great Fire of London.
As you do, because that's your first thought, isn't it? When a dreadful fire is about to raze your house to the ground, it's, oh, my Parmesan cheese.
To be fair, in that day and age, it's not like you could just nip down to the local corner shop and get, your sort of value Parmesan knockoff cheese.
That's true.
This was imported from Italy. It was very expensive. You had to have some cash behind you to afford Parmesan in those days.
I guess. But really, I mean, what did you do with Parmesan cheese in the 1600s? I mean, it's not like you're grating it on your spag bol, is it? Or is it? I don't know.
They were.
Does anybody know? Did they have spag bol to put Parmesan cheese on in the 1600s? Let us know.
Maybe we'll have to check his diary.
Indeed. Touché. Well, it was probably the plague that brought him to Brampton. Although we think of the plague being the disaster of 1665, the disease actually struck London several times. Pepys was born and grew up in London, and it's thought that a bad outbreak of the plague is what prompted Pepys' father to send the young boy away to live with his uncle in Brampton, Huntingdonshire. Even after his uncle's death, the Brampton home remained in the family, with Pepys' parents moving there later in life. As an adult, Pepys often had opportunity to visit the house from his childhood, although he sometimes stayed, and certainly drank, at the local hostelry, the Black Bull. In a diary entry, he praised the landlady for her beer, fresh with a taste of wormwood, which ever after did please me very well. And it must have pleased him very much indeed, because he sometimes still visits the inn. Witnesses have encountered the apparition of Pepys in the Black Bull, and have described him as a portly gentleman wearing black clothing and a long wig. Slightly less jovially though, Samuel Pepys' ghost has also been seen in the churchyard of St Mary Magdalene, wending its way between the gravestones with its head bowed, and there's long been a local legend that he's looking for his buried treasure. And again, we're back to burying things everywhere.
Pepys was known to have buried treasure in Brampton. In 1667, he received news in his official capacity with the Navy that the Dutch Navy had seized an English warship and were readying themselves to sail up the Thames. As was his wont, he dispatched his wealth to Brampton with instructions to bury it for safety, and apparently never did recover all of it.
No, actually, it was quite a lot of money, £1,300 in gold. So in 1667, that really is quite a wealth. And even if you can't recover a little bit of it, that's still going to be quite a lot of money to be looking for.
That gets you a lot of Parmesan even now.
Despite the fact that the legend has always been that he's been searching for his buried treasure while his apparition is seen walking through this graveyard, I happen to have a different theory. Now, we know that he liked to drink at the Black Bull, and as I say, having been there, by far the quickest way home from the pub is through the graveyard and across the field. And the idea of an apparition with its head bowed, it seems quite sort of surly and sinister, but it could also be somebody that's maybe had a few.
Yes, he's drunk, isn't he? He's on his way home from the pub.
Yeah, I think he's squiffy and he's on his way home from the pub.
If he's looking for anything, it's a kebab shop.
That's a wonderful image. Pepys in a kebab shop in his wig. Love it. Well, I'm afraid that's just about all we've got time for this episode. Thank you again to everybody that's contributed or sent in stories. And if you have a story you want to share with us, please do get in touch. Now, you've heard us talk before about FITS being available for mixing and production services, and we've had some rather exciting developments on that front.
Yes, I have recently launched an audio production company. We will be dealing with editing, mixing, audio repair, and other services supporting spoken word audio projects. We're also looking to expand the services we provide all the time, so if you visit our website and find we haven't got listed something that you need, please do get in touch, as we may be able to provide that for you as well. If you'd like to get in touch or find out more information, please do visit our website, narrativeaudio.com.
Well, that's all from us today, but we hope you'll join us next episode.
UKP session end.